Ben Needham. A British family moved to a sunlit Greek island to start a new life together. Within weeks, their youngest member wandered out of a farmhouse and was never seen again. Ben Needham was a small boy from Sheffield, in England. In the spring of 1991, his young mother, Carrie, along with her parents and her two brothers, relocated from Sheffield to the village of Herakles on the Greek island of Kos, hoping to begin a fresh chapter. Carrie's father was renovating a farmhouse in the village, and Carrie herself had taken a job at a nearby hotel. It was meant to be the start of something good for the whole family. So how did that new life turn into a mystery that has lasted more than 3 decades? On the 24th of July, 1991, Ben was left in the care of his grandparents at the farmhouse, while Carrie worked her shift at the hotel. He spent the morning wandering in and out of the property, which was still being renovated. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, the adults realized that Ben was no longer in sight anywhere around the farmhouse. At first, the family assumed that his teenage uncle had taken him for a ride on a moped. But when the uncle was found alone, Greek police were notified. What happened next set the case back from the very start. The Hellenic police initially treated the Needham family themselves as suspects. A notification to airports and ferries was delayed in those crucial early hours. Searches by police, the Greek army, and the fire brigade over 11 days produced nothing at all. Carrie has since described the original handling of the case as a complete sham. If a child had been carried off the island in those hours, the failure to seal the ports and airports may well have made it possible. And then, after 11 days of fruitless searching, the case went quiet for many years, with no answers, no arrests, and no clear direction for the investigation to take. It was revived in 2012 around an unusual and painful theory. South Yorkshire police took up a lead suggesting that a now-deceased local digger driver had accidentally struck Ben with an excavator while clearing land near the farmhouse and had buried him in rubble. Could the answer really have been a tragic accident, hidden in plain sight near the family's own home all along? 2 formal excavations followed, one in 2012 and a larger one in 2016. The second of them shifting hundreds of tons of soil and recovering a small toy car and a piece of a sandal. A forensic soil scientist examined the sandal fragment and reported a profile on it that was consistent with human blood decomposition. For a moment, after 25 years of uncertainty, it seemed the long case might finally have its answer. But in November 2018, DNA tests showed that the blood found on the toy car was not Ben's at all. The excavation theory had not delivered the proof that everyone had hoped for, and the family was left waiting once again, with the central question still open. So where does the case stand now? The most recent chapter has reopened an older idea, the possibility that Ben may have been taken and raised elsewhere. In July 2025, South Yorkshire police were reported to be investigating an email originating in the United States, claiming that Ben had been seen at a church there in the early 1990s. Then, in March 2026, it was reported that a man based in the United States had come forward claiming he might be Ben, with photographs said to match age-progressed images of him, and DNA testing through Interpol was pending. At the same time, South Yorkshire police announced that their major crime unit would no longer actively investigate, taking instead a role as a link between the Greek authorities and Carrie Needham. Carrie described that decision as a devastating step backwards. A new life on a sunlit island, a busy morning at a half-renovated farmhouse, and a pending DNA test that may, at last, hold an answer to a question more than 3 decades old. The next case shares an unsettling amount with this one. A family on holiday in a foreign country, a young child gone in the evening, and a first police response that critics have long said was badly mishandled. Madeleine McCann. A young British girl vanished from a holiday apartment one evening while her parents dined a short walk away. 19 years later, the case is still one of the most heavily investigated in the world. Madeleine McCann was the young daughter of British doctors Kate and Gerry McCann from Leicester, in England. In late April 2007, the family arrived for a 7-night package holiday at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, on Portugal's Algarve coast, traveling with 7 friends and Madeleine's 2 younger twin siblings. It was an ordinary family holiday in a popular resort. So how did it become a case that the entire world would come to know? On the evening of the 3rd of May 2007, the McCann children were put to bed at around 8:30 in their ground floor apartment at the resort. The 9 adults dined together at the resort's tapas restaurant, only a short walk away, and they took turns through the evening returning to check on their respective children roughly every half hour. One of the friends checked at around 9:30 and saw the twins, but did not visually confirm that Madeleine was there in the room. At around 10 o'clock, Kate McCann returned to the apartment and found Madeleine gone, with the bedroom window open and the shutter raised. One member of the group, dining at the same restaurant, reported having seen a man carrying a child away from the resort earlier that night, a sighting that became a cornerstone of the abduction theory. That particular sighting was later traced by British detectives to an innocent father carrying his own child home that evening. If that lead, the very basis of the abduction theory, was a dead end, where did that leave the search for what had really happened to Madeleine? The investigation took several turns over the years. Portuguese police initially named the McCanns themselves as formal suspects, a status known locally as arguido, based partly on hits from British sniffer dogs trained to detect traces of blood. Those dogs had reacted both inside the apartment and around a hire car that the family had rented some weeks after Madeleine vanished, though no firm forensic conclusion was ever drawn from the dogs' alerts. That suspect status was lifted by the Portuguese Attorney General in 2008. The British Metropolitan Police later launched their own investigation, known as Operation Grange, in 2011. Then, in June 2020, German prosecutors named a German national, Christian Bruckner, as the prime suspect in the case. Who is the man at the center of the German inquiry? Bruckner was living roughly a mile from the McCann apartment at the time that Madeleine disappeared. He was later extradited from Portugal to Germany and sentenced there to 7 years for a serious crime committed in Praia da Luz back in 2005. In October 2024, a German court acquitted him of several other unrelated charges. It is important to be clear on one point. He has never been charged in connection with Madeleine McCann, and he has consistently denied any involvement in her disappearance. Bruckner completed his 7-year sentence and was released from a prison in the German state of Lower Saxony in September 2025, driven away and fitted with an electronic ankle tag. What happens now that the man named as the prime suspect is a free man, walking the streets again? The British Metropolitan Police have been reported to be working to bring Bruckner to Britain to face questioning. But a significant legal barrier stands in the way. German officials have confirmed that their constitution blocks the extradition of German nationals to non-European Union countries, a barrier reported to have been intensified by Brexit. A German prosecutor dismissed the British effort, noting that no arrest warrant currently exists, while German prosecutors have publicly stated they believe Madeleine is dead. The 3rd of May, 2026, marked 19 years since Madeleine disappeared from that ground floor apartment. Her parents have continued to mark each anniversary, and the official investigation has never been formally closed. An open window, a raised shutter, a short walk back from dinner. and a case that, after almost 2 decades and one of the largest police investigations in modern history, still has no charge and no body. The next case is older still, and it remains one of the most haunting in an entire nation's memory. 3 young siblings who set off for a beach together on a summer holiday morning. The Beaumont children. 3 siblings caught a bus to the beach on a hot holiday morning. They were due home by midday. They never came back, and the case has never been solved. Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont lived at a house in Somerton Park, a suburb of Adelaide in South Australia, with their parents, Jim and Nancy. The 26th of January, 1966, was Australia Day, in the middle of a summer heat wave, and Jim had driven away on a sales trip the previous afternoon. That morning, Nancy gave the children money for their bus fares and lunch, and they caught the bus a few kilometers to Glenelg Beach, due back home on the noon bus. They never returned. How does an ordinary trip to the beach end in a mystery that has lasted 60 years? The witness accounts that followed only deepened the alarm. Multiple witnesses placed the 3 children at a beachside reserve in the company of a tall, lean, tanned man in his mid-30s, with fair to light brown hair and a thin face. Witnesses said the man had claimed that Jane's purse had been stolen. The group was last reliably seen leaving the beach together, and then at a local cake shop, where Jane paid for food with a £1 note, even though Nancy had given the children only coins. Where had that money come from? A postman who knew the family saw the 3 children walking alone in the direction of home that afternoon, the last confirmed sighting of them. A massive search was launched within 24 hours, and a nearby boat haven was drained as part of it. The South Australian government's standing reward for the case today stands at $1 million. Yet none of the 3 children was ever found, and not a single confirmed trace of them has ever surfaced. With a search that large, in a city desperate to bring 3 children home, how did the trail go so completely cold? Over the decades, several names have drawn attention. One was Bevan Spencer von Einem, a convicted offender who was linked to the case through second-hand claims made by an informant. Another suggested name was a convicted child murderer, though he was likely too young in 1966 to match the witness descriptions. A former scoutmaster also came to attention through a child's diary and was later questioned, though he was convicted only of unrelated historical offenses. But the name that has driven the most recent searches is a different one altogether. That name is Harry Phipps, an Adelaide factory owner who was identified as a suspect after a 2013 book about the case was published. Phipps's own estranged son named him publicly as a suspect, and 2 brothers said that Phipps had paid them, when they were boys, to dig a large, grave-sized hole at his North Plympton factory site just days after the children disappeared. That claim about a freshly dug hole would go on to shape years of searching at the site. The factory site was excavated in 2013 and again in 2018, with the later dig recovering only non-human bones. In February 2025, a 3rd privately funded dig began at the same Plympton site, and according to reporting, more than 3,000 cubic meters of soil were excavated, in some places to a depth of several meters. That 3rd dig concluded in early March 2025 without finding any human remains. A 2025 book on the case also introduced an anonymous witness who made fresh claims about the factory owner, though those claims have not been independently confirmed by police. So where does the case rest now, 60 years on? South Australian police have publicly maintained their skepticism toward the factory owner theory, saying it remains unsupported by hard physical evidence. Both parents have since died, Nancy in 2019 and Jim in 2023. Neither of them ever learning what had happened to their 3 children. The case is the longest-running missing person case in Australian history, and it remains officially open, with the $1 million reward still standing, a bus ticket, a noon bus that came back to the stop empty, and a country that, 6 decades later, has never once stopped asking what happened that morning. The next case crosses to a different beach, on a different stretch of the same Portuguese coast, where another young child ran ahead of his family one evening and vanished. René Haase. A young German boy on a family holiday ran a short distance ahead of his mother along a quiet Portuguese beach. In the space of those few moments, he was gone. René Haase was a young blonde-haired boy from the Elsdorf area of North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. In June 1996, he was on holiday with his mother, Anita, who worked as a postal worker, along with her partner in a camper van in the western Algarve region of Portugal. His father, Andreas, was separated from his mother at the time and was not on the trip. It was a family holiday on a quiet, scenic stretch of the western Algarve coast, the kind of trip that should have produced nothing but ordinary summer memories. So what happened on that beach in the early evening? On the 21st of June, 1996, the family had eaten lunch near a beach just north of the town of Algesur, and they walked down to the shore together in the early evening, at around 6 o'clock. René, described by his father as a very careful child, ran roughly 20 to 30 meters ahead of his mother along the open sand. Anita later told a German newspaper that their son had suddenly disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. His clothes were found on the beach. How does a careful child vanish in a matter of seconds, in open view of his own mother, on a clear stretch of beach? That single question has shaped the case ever since, and to this day, it has never been answered. The local police, the Guardia Nacional Republicana, initially favored the theory that René had drowned. Anita Haase publicly disputed that conclusion, saying she felt the police were not very interested and had simply told her that her son had probably drowned. Officers, for their part, said they had in fact spent day after day searching the beach for the boy. The case was later handed to a national police force, and a specialist eventually concluded that the tide and the current conditions that evening made a swimming accident unlikely. René's footprints, it was said, simply stopped in the middle of the sand with nothing leading toward the water. If he had not drowned, then what had become of him? For more than 20 years, that question went unanswered, and the case lay dormant, all but forgotten by the wider world outside René's own grieving family. But then, 2 decades on, it gained a new and deeply troubling thread. Over the years, a convicted German offender, a man responsible for serious crimes against boys in Germany, was questioned in connection with the case, though he was never charged with anything relating to René. And in June 2020, after German prosecutors named Christian Brueckner as the prime suspect in the Madeleine McCann case, German investigators contacted René's father for the first time in 2 decades to tell him they were re-examining René's disappearance. Why would investigators connect the 2 cases at all? Brueckner had been regularly resident in the Algarve region from 1995 onward, and he would have been a young man in June 1996, living within a relatively short distance of Algesur. That overlap of place and time placed him, geographically at least, within reach of René's disappearance. It is essential to be clear, though. This link is purely a line of investigation, not a charge of any kind. Brueckner has never been charged in connection with René Haase, and he has consistently denied any involvement in these cases. René remains missing to this day, with no confirmed trace of him ever found in all the years since that summer evening. His father has said that the prospect his son had fallen into the hands of an offender was, in his own words, much worse to contemplate than the possibility of a drowning. No charges have ever been filed against anyone, and the case is dormant but officially open with the Portuguese authorities. A short run ahead along the sand, a set of small clothes left behind on a quiet beach, and a line of footprints that ended in the open with no answer at all. The next case moves from a holiday coast to a busy military base in Germany, and to a young child who slipped away in the few short seconds that her mother's back was turned at a checkout. Catrice Lee. It was her birthday, and the shopping complex was packed with crowds collecting their pay before Christmas. Her mother turned away for less than a minute, and when she turned back, the child was simply gone. Catrice Lee was the younger daughter of a senior British Army soldier and his wife, Sharon. She had been born at a British military hospital in West Germany. The family lived in Schloss Neuhaus, a suburb of Paderborn, in what was then West Germany, where her father was stationed with the British Army of the Rhine. She had an older sister, Natasha. So how did a family shopping trip on a busy afternoon end with a child vanishing without a trace? The 28th of November, 1981, was Catrice's birthday, and it was also the last payday before Christmas. So the shopping complex on the base was exceptionally busy that day. Her father drove the family to the complex and waited outside in the car park. Sharon carried Catrice through the supermarket and set her down at the checkout, then briefly stepped away to fetch a forgotten packet of crisps. Catrice's aunt, who was also there shopping with them, thought the child had simply followed Sharon. But when Sharon returned in under a minute, Catrice was gone. In less than 60 seconds, in a shop full of paying customers, a young child had vanished. She had been wearing red boots, a turquoise coat, and a tartan dress that day. And yet no one in that busy supermarket reported seeing her leave. How could that possibly happen? And how could the trail go so completely cold so quickly afterward? The early investigation, handled by the Royal Military Police alongside West German civilian police, favored the theory that Catrice had wandered off on her own to a nearby river and drowned. The river was dredged in the search, but no body and no trace of her was ever found in the water. For the family, that drowning conclusion never felt right, and the years that followed would give them real reason to doubt it. The first response, the family has long argued, was deeply and damagingly flawed. Sniffer dogs were reportedly not used for a full 24 hours, supermarket staff were not interviewed for 6 weeks, and border control checkpoints were never alerted at all. Catrice also had a distinctive eye condition, a detail that could have helped members of the public recognize her. And yet, it was not publicized at the time of her disappearance. How much of the trail, and how much of the chance to find her, was simply lost in those early days and weeks? The case lay largely dormant until the year 2000, when an age-progressed image was produced and new witnesses came forward, including a man who had stood directly behind the family at the supermarket checkout that day. Another new witness was a woman whose former partner, a soldier, had reportedly made a disturbing remark about a missing child. In 2012, a British defense minister and the Royal Military Police formally apologized to the family after an internal review identified a series of failings, and a new investigation, known as Operation Butte, was launched. That inquiry later produced an image of a man with a green saloon car who had been seen on a bridge over a river the day after the disappearance. In 2018, a 5-week forensic excavation of a riverbank found no evidence, and a man arrested in connection with the case in 2019 was released without charge. So where does the case stand today? In December 2022, a new Tri-Service Defense Serious Crime Unit took over the investigation from the Royal Military Police. Catrice's father has campaigned tirelessly over the decades, at one point threatening to return his own service medals in protest at the handling of the case, and planning a march in London. To mark what would have been one of her birthdays, an exhibition was opened in the former shopping complex on the base where she had vanished all those years before. Her parents continue to believe that Catrice was abducted and raised by another family, perhaps by a couple who simply wanted a child of their own. A birthday, a crowded checkout, and a single missing minute that a family has now spent more than 40 years trying to undo. The next case crosses the Atlantic to the American Midwest, and to a boy who set off on an ordinary morning paper route and never came home. Johnny Gosch. A paperboy left home before dawn to deliver the Sunday newspapers on his usual route. His little wagon was found 2 blocks away, still loaded, and the boy himself was simply gone. Johnny Gosch lived in West Des Moines, in Iowa, with his parents, John and Noreen Gosch. He was a newspaper delivery boy for the Des Moines Register, with his own route of customers and a service award for his reliability. He had a distinctive birthmark on his face. On a quiet suburban street, he was the dependable boy who never missed a delivery. So how did one ordinary Sunday paper route turn into one of America's most haunting missing child cases? On Sunday, the 5th of September, 1982, over the Labor Day weekend, Johnny left home shortly before 6 in the morning, taking the family dog and his little red wagon. Normally, he would wake his father to come along with him. But that morning, he set off on his own. Other paper boys saw him at the newspaper drop, where the bundles were left out for the boys to collect and deliver. What the witnesses described next is the very heart of the case. A fellow paper boy and another witness nearby both reported seeing Johnny stop and talk with a man in a 2-toned blue car. A neighbor heard a car door slam and saw a vehicle speed away from the area. At around 7:45, a customer phoned the Gosch home to complain that no paper had arrived, and Johnny's father went out searching for him. He found Johnny's red wagon 2 blocks from the family home, still loaded with the undelivered newspapers, and the family dog had already returned home alone. The route had been abandoned mid-delivery. Where had the boy gone in those few early morning minutes? The first response, the family later argued, was badly hampered by the rules and attitudes of the time. Local police policy then required a waiting period before a missing teenager was treated as anything other than a runaway. Officers who arrived at the scene reportedly asked the family whether the boy had ever run away from home before. Johnny's mother has described that response and the slow start it produced as deeply damaging to the search. How much ground was lost in those first crucial hours, while the disappearance was being treated as something less than an emergency? That delay would have a lasting consequence far beyond Iowa. Johnny was among the first missing children to be featured on milk cartons, a campaign that began in Iowa in 1984 after another local paperboy disappeared. A third Des Moines boy disappeared in 1986, adding to the fear in the area. The Gosch family also lobbied successfully for a new Iowa law which mandated an immediate police response to reports of a missing child. A boy's disappearance had reshaped the way an entire state responded to the next one. Over the years, the case drew theories and claimed leads, but none ever produced a definitive answer. Johnny's mother, Noreen, has said that in 1997, her son, by then a grown man, came to her door late at night with another man, spoke with her for a time, and then left. Johnny's father, who by then was divorced from Noreen, has publicly said he is not certain that visit took place. Other claims emerged over the decades, and at least one man was found to have defrauded the family with a false story about Johnny's fate. Which leads, if any, were ever real? So where does the case stand now? No arrests have ever been made in connection with Johnny's disappearance. A police official has stated publicly that there has not been one substantial piece of evidence tying any named individual to the case. Familial DNA has been collected from the Gosh family and entered into databases, and the case file is said to fill 7 drawers at the local police department. Johnny's mother has continued to run a foundation in his name, and the case remains officially open. A dog that came home alone, a wagon still full of newspapers, and a paper route that was never finished. The next case is, in some ways, the one that changed everything. A boy who walked toward his school bus alone for the first time on a New York street. Ethan Patz. For the very first time, his parents let him walk the short route to his school bus stop alone. He never reached the bus, and his disappearance would help launch the modern missing children movement. Ethan Patz was the young son of professional photographer Stanley Patz and his wife Julie, and the family lived in the Soho neighborhood of New York City. At the time, Soho was a working-class district, and it reportedly had one of the lowest crime rates in the city. Ethan was a young schoolchild, eager, like many children his age, for a small measure of independence. It was, by the standards of the day, a safe place to grant him that. So how did one short walk become a case that would go on to reshape an entire country? Friday, the 25th of May, 1979, was the last school day before a holiday weekend. For the very first time, Ethan's parents allowed him to walk the roughly 2-block route on his own, from the family home to his school bus stop. He was wearing a pilot-style cap and carrying a book bag, along with $1 to buy a soda at a corner store. Ethan never boarded the bus that morning, and his parents did not realize he was missing until that afternoon, when he failed to return home from school. Julie Patz called the police, and an intense search began that evening, with nearly 100 officers and bloodhounds combing the neighborhood. For the parents who had just granted that small piece of freedom, how quickly an ordinary day had turned. The search found nothing, but the case did something no missing child case had done before. Ethan's father, a commercial photographer, distributed photographs of his son widely, and the image of the missing boy helped fuel what would become the modern missing children movement. In 1983, the American president designated the 25th of May as National Missing Children's Day, in part because of Ethan's case. Ethan was declared legally dead in 2001, and his remains have never been found. For decades, the case had no resolution, and no remains were ever found. An earlier suspect, a convicted offender, had drawn the attention of a federal prosecutor in the 1980s, and Ethan's parents won a civil judgment against him. But no criminal charge over Ethan ever followed. Then, in 2012, the case took a dramatic new turn. A man named Pedro Hernandez, who had worked at a shop near the bus stop in 1979, became a suspect after a relative tipped off police. Hernandez confessed to detectives, telling them that he had lured Ethan into a basement, and he later repeated the account on videotape. Around the same time, investigators searched a basement near the original route, but nothing conclusive was found there. But how reliable was that confession? Hernandez was questioned by police for more than 7 hours before he was read his rights, and his defense pointed to a documented history of mental illness. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. A first trial in 2015 ended with a hung jury, and a 2017 retrial found Hernandez guilty with a sentence of 25 years to life. That was not the end of the legal story, however. In July 2025, a federal appeals court overturned Hernandez's conviction, finding that the trial judge had given a flawed answer to a jury question about the confessions. The court described the error as a serious one that had not been harmless to the case. A federal judge then ordered that Hernandez must be retried or released. In November 2025, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office announced it would retry him. So where does the case stand today? A third trial is on track, and in April 2026, a judge denied a defense motion to dismiss the case on procedural grounds. Hernandez, who is now in his 60s, remains incarcerated while awaiting that retrial, and it must be said clearly that, with his conviction vacated, he is presumed innocent unless and until a jury decides otherwise. Eaton's body has never been recovered. A 2-block walk, a first small taste of independence, and a case still searching more than 4 decades later for a final and certain answer. The next case moves north into the Canadian wilderness and to a boy who slipped away from a family fishing trip beside a quiet lake. Adrian McNaughton. A young boy went fishing one afternoon with his father and his older brothers at a quiet lake in Ontario. He sat down on a rock to rest, and in a few brief, unwatched moments, he was gone. Adrian McNaughton was a small boy from the Arnprior area of Ontario, in Canada, the son of a man named Murray McNaughton. At 5 years old, he was a small, slight child with blonde hair and brown eyes, and a small scar on his forehead. He had several older brothers, and the family lived an ordinary life in the Ottawa Valley region. So how did one ordinary family afternoon by the water turn into one of the largest searches in Canadian history? On a Monday afternoon, the 12th of June, 1972, Murray McNaughton took Adrian, his 2 older brothers, and a family friend out fishing at Holmes Lake near Calabogie, about 100 kilometers west of Ottawa. After about an hour at the water, Adrian grew frustrated with a tangled fishing line, handed the rod back to his father, and sat down on a nearby rock to wait. When Murray finished untangling the line and looked up again, at around 6 in the evening, Adrian was simply gone. He was wearing a blue jacket, an orange-striped shirt, brown shorts, and rubber-soled boots, and not one of those items has ever been recovered. How does a child vanish from a rock beside his own father and brothers, with no sound and no trace at all? That question has hung over the case for more than 5 decades. Murray sent Adrian's eldest brother back to the car to look for him, and when the boy could not be found anywhere, police were called to the lake. The search that followed quickly grew into one of the largest in Canadian history. Hundreds of civilian volunteers joined hundreds of soldiers in searching dozens of square miles of dense bush and land around the lake, while divers searched Holmes Lake and the smaller lakes around it. Heavy rain that set in soon afterward hampered the tracking dogs and washed away any scent. A military officer leading the effort publicly stated that there was no sign Adrian was, or ever had been, in the area at all. With a search that vast, covering so much ground, how could a small boy leave no trace whatsoever? The case stayed cold for decades, but it was never truly abandoned, and over time new tools and new attention were brought to bear on it. In 2009, the Ontario Provincial Police released an age-progressed sketch of how Adrian might look as a grown adult. In 2016, a Canadian podcast devoted its entire first season to the case, drawing fresh national attention to it. And during the work of that series, several trained cadaver dogs alerted to specific areas of Holmes Lake. Trained volunteer divers later went down into the lake to search those areas themselves. After more than 40 years, it seemed the lake itself might finally be pointing toward an answer. In 2018, an investigative team used a core sampler in Holmes Lake, finding distinct layers of stacked silt, and cadaver dogs gave responses on 2 of the samples that were brought up from the bottom. But police divers later concluded that recovering any remains from the lake would be impossible, given the very poor underwater visibility in the deep, soft sediment at the bottom. Skeletal remains found near the lake in a separate instance were tested and ruled out as belonging to Adrian. Even where the lake itself seemed to hint at an answer, it would not give one up. So where does the case rest now? Adrian remains missing, and the case is held by the Ontario Provincial Police, which has reaffirmed in recent years that it is open, with a reward of $50,000 standing for information. Investigators have noted that, if Adrian is somehow alive, he might carry only fleeting memories of his early childhood. Adrian's father, Murray McNaughton, died in 2024 without ever receiving the closure he had spent his life waiting for. A tangled fishing line, a rock beside the water, and a quiet Ontario lake that has kept its secret for more than 50 years. The next case returns to the United States, to a Florida home and a night that ended with a young girl gone and a back door propped open with a block of cement. Holly Cummings. A young girl was put to bed in her family's home one ordinary winter night, just like any other. By the early hours of the next morning, her bed was empty and the back door had been propped open with a heavy cement block. Holly Cummings was a young kindergarten student who lived in a home on Green Lane in Satsuma, a small community in Putnam County, Florida. She lived with her father, Ronald Cummings, her younger brother, and her father's teenage girlfriend, Misty Crosland. Her mother lived elsewhere in the state of Florida. It was, on the surface, an ordinary working household in a quiet Florida community. So how did one ordinary night at home end in a disappearance that, all these years later, has never been solved? Ronald Cummings was working a night shift in February 2009. According to Misty Crosland's account to police, she put Holly and her younger brother to bed in the evening, then woke in the early hours of the morning to find Holly's bed empty and the back door of the home propped open with a cement block. Ronald returned home from his night shift, found his daughter missing, and called for help right away, and an alert was issued for her across the state of Florida. A propped open door and an empty bed in the small hours of a winter morning. What had happened inside that quiet house overnight? From the very start, the investigation ran into serious difficulty. Tracking dogs followed a trail leading away from the house and toward a nearby river the very next morning. Investigators reported that there were holes in Misty Crosland's account of the night, and that her story changed more than once as she was questioned over the following weeks and months. Other people had reportedly been at the house that night as well, adding still more names and more uncertainty to the picture. Why would the account given by the last adult known to be with Holly keep shifting in that way? The case soon became tangled with other crimes entirely. In early 2010, Misty Crosland, Ronald Cummings, and several other people were arrested in an undercover drug trafficking operation, an investigation that had actually begun before Holly ever disappeared. Later that same year, the sheriff announced that Holly's case was being formally reclassified as a homicide, and divers searched a stretch of the nearby river once again, returning to the water that the tracking dogs had pointed toward. Misty Crosland was sentenced to a long prison term for the drug trafficking, and Ronald Cummings received a substantial prison term as well. The people closest to Holly were now behind bars, but not for anything directly to do with her disappearance, and the central question remained unanswered. What do investigators now believe actually happened to Haley? On the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, in 2019, Putnam County investigators publicly acknowledged that they believed Haley had died and that her body had been placed in the nearby river soon afterward. In 2024, a National Missing Children Center released a new age progression image, showing how Holly might look as a young woman today were she still alive. Yet a belief, however firmly held, is not the same as proof. And without Holly herself, the case could not be closed. So where does the case stand today? Holly has never been found, and no one has ever been charged in connection with her disappearance. Misty Crosland remains in Florida state custody, with a release date set for later this decade. Ronald Cummings, after his eventual release from prison, was later arrested again on a separate and unrelated set of charges. A senior official with the Putnam County Sheriff's Office has publicly said that Crosland was there when it happened, that she knows what happened, and that she is considered a person of interest in the case. The case has produced thousands of tips over the years, and despite all of them, it remains classified as an unsolved homicide, a cement block holding a door open, an empty bed, and an account that, all these years later, has never quite held together. The final case is the oldest of them all, a Christmas Eve house fire, 5 children who were never accounted for, and a family who refused, to the very end, to believe the official story. The Sodder children. A house fire on Christmas Eve destroyed a family home in West Virginia. The parents and several of the children escaped. 5 of the children were never seen again, and their parents never accepted that they had died in the flames. George Sodder was an Italian immigrant who ran a successful trucking company in Fayetteville, West Virginia, and he and his wife Jenny had 10 children together. On Christmas Eve, 1945, 9 of the children were home, while one son was away serving in the Army. The youngest children had stayed up late to play with new toys. It was the end of an ordinary holiday evening. So why does this fire still trouble people 80 years later? At around 1 in the morning on the 25th of December, 1945, fire broke out in the Sodder family home. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children managed to escape the burning house. 5 of the Sodder children, who had been upstairs, were never seen again. A house fire would normally be presumed to have claimed them. But almost nothing about that night behaved the way an ordinary accidental house fire should. Consider the strange details that piled up that night and afterward. A telephone call had come into the house in the early hours, from an unknown woman asking for someone who did not live there, with odd laughter in the background. The home's telephone line was later found to have been cut rather than burned through. George's ladder, which was normally kept beside the house, was found some distance away the next day. Both of his trucks, which had worked perfectly fine the day before, would not start that morning. And the fire department, located not far away, did not arrive until well into the morning. Why would a simple accidental fire leave behind so many things that looked, instead, deliberate? The evidence that should have been there was also strangely missing. Despite 5 children supposedly being inside the house, no remains were ever recovered from the ruins. A later excavation of the site produced only a few small findings, and an object the fire chief once claimed to have found in the ashes was later identified as fresh beef liver that had never been exposed to heat at all. If 5 children had truly died in that house, where was the physical evidence of it? It was that absence, more than anything, that drove the family's doubt. The official cause was ruled an electrical fault, but the Sodders refused to accept that conclusion. Their doubt only deepened over the years, as scattered reports came in of children resembling the missing 5 being seen alive elsewhere, including a sighting at a motel and another reported in a different state, and the family chased lead after lead. Could it be, the family came to believe, that the children had not died in the fire at all, but had been taken from the house? Then came the most haunting development of all. In the late 1960s, more than 20 years after the fire, an envelope arrived at the Sodder home, postmarked from Kentucky, containing a photograph of a young man in his 20s who closely resembled one of the missing sons. On the back of the photograph was a short, puzzling handwritten note. The family hired a private investigator to follow up the lead, and the investigator reportedly took their money and disappeared. Was the young man in that photograph really one of their children, grown up and alive somewhere far from home? No one ever proved it either way. The Sodders erected a large billboard along a state route, with photographs of the 5 children and an appeal for any information, and it stood there for decades as a fixture of the area. George Sodder died in 1969, and Jenny reportedly wore black until her own death in 1989, after which the billboard was finally taken down. The youngest child of the family, who had been very small on the night of the fire, lived into the 21st century, and surviving relatives have continued private inquiries. No remains were ever recovered, and the case is now widely considered unlikely ever to be solved. A fire on Christmas Eve, a cut telephone line, a missing ladder, and a photograph that arrived in the mail decades later. The answer never came. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.